In the Bible, deserts or the wilderness has always represented times of crisis, moments of affliction, of shortage, of drought, and so there are many deserts through which mankind or human beings can go through during their lives. But there's something interesting here. It's not the actual desert what kills people, but instead it's the absence of water that can lead a person to lose their lives in the desert, in the wilderness. So what does this mean to us? It means that crisis will not destroy us, but if we are not prepared, if we do not take the precautions, the spiritual precautions we need to have, then crisis can end our spiritual life. Good morning, I am Pastor Carlos Rios, and this is our Devotional Mana, a daily adventure with God. We are talking about crisis, and today, the fifth man I would like to talk to you about also has a very important representation in our lives. This is the prophet Elijah. If you join me in the first book of Kings, chapter 17, verse 1 says, Now Elijah, the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab, As the Lord the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word. Elijah lived in a very critical and difficult time. The government in the time of Elijah was headed by a man named Ahab. Ahab not only was a man who did not know God nor give him honor or glory, but in addition he was married to a woman named Jezebel, a very evil woman who adored idols, Baals in those days. And while in power, this husband and wife duo began to incline the hearts of Israel towards other gods. And so while they had the power and they offered people gifts, help, and things, and these things led the people to incline very easily, to bow down. And amongst these were God's people. Behind the gifts, behind the favors, behind what this royal family was offering them, they would end up adoring other gods. And based on this, we can understand the crisis that Israel was going through. In those times, 3.5 years, where it did not rain in the land of Israel, you can imagine the consequences. Imagine what happens to a place when it does not rain for 3.5 years. Consecutively, the wells dry up, the rivers dry up, the plants will die, the crops will not exist, and of course no fruits. The animals will die. 3.5 years without rain means 3.5 years in crisis, of hunger, of death, of desolation. And so allow me to tell you, this was something very impactful for Israel. Elijah had received an order from God so that there would not be rain over the earth. And so we may ask ourselves, then, what was going on with Israel, and why was God doing something so impactful, so forceful with his very own nation? Why such a severe judgment? First, let's think about something. Israel's judgment is not severe because we must say that this should not have come as a surprise to the nation of Israel. If you recall, those of you who have read the Bible, or you can take the passage I'm going to give you as reference. There's a very important passage in the Bible in Deuteronomy chapter 18. When you have some time, read it, and you can read about what I am going to tell you. This passage of Deuteronomy chapter 18, Deuteronomy chapter 28, it says, If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations on earth. All these blessings will come on you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. And so the Lord begins to give a list. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, the crops of the land and the young of your livestock, the calves of your herds and lambs of your flocks. Your basket will be blessed. You will be blessed when you come in and blessed when you go out. The Lord will send a blessing on your barns and on everything you put your hand on. The Lord will bless your land. He will bless your livestock. You will lend to many nations, but you will borrow from none. The Lord will make you the head, not the tail. But in the second part of the same chapter of Deuteronomy 28, however, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come on you. You'll be cursed in the city, cursed in the country. Your land will be cursed, your livestock will be cursed. So will your basket, the work of your hands. You will be in the back and not the front. You will borrow and not lend to anyone. And so Israel clearly knew the conclusion of Deuteronomy 28 was as follows: I place in front of you life and death, blessing and curse. This was very clear to Israel. There was something that God would condemn. It was idolatry. And God would not tolerate his people to be involved in these types of practices. Until crisis came. And allow me to tell you, these 3.5 years represented much pain for Israel. And of course, the prophet at that time was Elijah. And Elijah had to live part of this process. Let's continue reading first book of Kings 17. Verse 2, it says, Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. And so God was ordering Elijah to be separated, to leave as far as he could. And so Elijah left the desert and came to a small ravine. And the Lord spoke to him and said to him, look at what it says in verse 4. I'm reading 1 Kings 17. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. Notice that God employs two methods to take care of Elijah in the desert. One of them was a brook, a natural means to provide water that he needed, and the other was a supernatural means, because it says that he would direct the ravens to supply him with food. Verse 7, sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Look, here was the prophet Elijah in the middle of the desert, and he would go to the brook each morning and notice that the water level each day was lower. And so it would not be difficult for him to calculate that the more time he was to spend in this place, eventually the brook would dry up completely and he would die of thirst. But the truth is that human calculations do not include a factor of extreme importance, and this is the grade of supernatural resources, spiritual resources. And this is what you and I must understand in the midst of crisis. Perhaps many of us are going through a crisis, and our crisis has a name. We can call it a desert, and it's a desert because there is a drought, because there is hunger, because we're going from failure to failure, because we're not seeing the blessing, because our body is becoming sick, and we're going from bad to worse. Because many circumstances come together representing this, a desert, total crisis. But there's something interesting here, because when we read this text, we realize that this type of crisis does not arise for no reason, or because God hates us, or God doesn't love us, or because God is filled with anger. No. These things happen as a consequences, and this is why I read Deuteronomy chapter 28. When these crises happen this way, they need to lead us to make a decision. And you know that the decision must lead us to face our lives, confront our idols, and the place that we're giving God in our hearts. And so what does Elijah do? Elijah says we must make a decision because matters are so grave. Today we must decide who is amongst us, who is in the middle of us, who is God to us. This simple. He says, let's do something. Let's gather up the entire people of Israel in Mount Carmelo. Let's move on to chapter 18 of this first book of Kings. And so Elijah said, let's resolve this. Let's take the people to Mount Carmelo, or Mount Carmel, and here we will see who God truly is. And if I read beginning verse 20 of chapter 18, it says, So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah said some words, and I want these words to speak to us this morning. I want God to speak to us through these words this morning. The first thing Elijah says in verse 21 when he confronts the people. Verse 21 says, Elijah went before the people and said, How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But the people said nothing. And so the prophet, what he's basically saying here is that we cannot continue playing these two games, where today God is God, tomorrow it's Baal. Today we belong to one, tomorrow to the other. Today we adore one, tomorrow we adore the other. And so this is why Elijah confronts them with saying, How long will you waver between two opinions? Because we cannot serve two lords, as Jesus said in the New Testament, because we love one and then hate the other. But we cannot have these types of uncertainties in our heart. Are you going through a crisis, and are you identifying crisis this way? in regards to this matter. So this is a good question the Lord has for us today. How much longer will we be back and forth between giving our lives to the Lord and doing what we have always done in the past? When will we finally choose to give our complete life to the Lord? To give our life completely to the Lord and not continue in the world and the things of the world? When will we make the decision to commit to God and to the cause and stop making promises to God that we will not fulfill? Crisis will come, but in the case of Job, it was different because Job did not sin. Joseph also did not sin. Paul did not sin. Daniel did not sin. But the crisis that Israel is living in this case is fruit of having separated themselves from God to adore other idols. And this is why God calls them up to Mount Carmel to talk to them. And so remember, Elijah said to the people, if the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. But you cannot serve both. Verse 22, I'm reading 1 Kings 18. He says, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. And it says that Elijah challenged them here at Mount Carmel. He told them, get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good. And so the challenge began. The only difference was this time there was going to be no one to light the fire. And so whoever was God would send fire from heaven. You can finish reading the passage on your own, but if you continue reading from verse 24 on, the false gods never answered, because this is always the conclusion of the Bible. If they are idols and false gods, how can they answer our prayers? If we ourselves are the ones who create false gods, we invoke them, and those who trust in them end up in the same way, end up the same as them, in falsehood and in lies. How could they pretend that a false god would respond to their prayers? But the time of truth came, and although they invoked a god in the morning and in the afternoon they prayed and sang, there was never an answer. Well, instead, Elijah had not even finished praying. And you know what happened? God sent a fire that consumed absolutely everything. And what it says in verse 30 calls my attention here in this 1 Kings chapter 18. Then Elijah said to all the people, come here to me. They came to him, and he repaired the altar of God, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, you shall be Israel, your name shall be Israel. With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And so Elijah said to the people, come here, come close, let's restore God's altar that had been destroyed. Let's turn to God wholeheartedly. And effectively, at the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Verse 37, it says, answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. If we want to come out of crisis, we must make the same decision Elijah made in regards to the people, confronting the people with their reality, leading them to once again edify their ruined lives, to once again rebuild their spiritual life. God heard Elijah because God is a living God. And perhaps many of you will come out of your crisis, of your deserts, of your droughts, of everything you are going through, the day that you acknowledge in your heart that it is time to turn back to God and to allow your heart to be confronted by Him and by His Word. And so do not disregard this message. And this entire week we will talk about Elijah, and we'll talk about the crisis that Elijah lived amongst the people and amongst these circumstances. And I know that God has many things to speak to our hearts. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for the beginning of this new day. Here we see another perspective, another man, another set of circumstances that are showing us a grave crisis, a fatal crisis, a crisis that brings death, destruction, hunger. Lord, I want you to speak to our hearts today, because perhaps the previous men we spoke about, their crisis had nothing to do with their sins. But in this case, it is an entire people, an entire nation that has left God to follow other gods, to believe in other gods, and this is why they are going through this crisis. Today, Lord, I pray the same prayer Elijah prayed. How long will we be between two opinions? If the Lord is God, we must give our lives to Him, but we cannot continue following different paths. Lord, may we trust in you and in your word each day. Thank you for leading us this week in our daily tasks and for leading us each day from glory to glory. We commend ourselves to you and we ask for your blessing in Christ Jesus. I await for you tomorrow. Blessings to all.